Malik Williams was sitting in the defendant's seat, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched on his lap. The courtroom around him seemed too vast, too cold, as if it had been built to crush anyone who entered. He already knew how this story would end, because he had seen it happen before. Boys like him, coming from forgotten neighborhoods, never left the same way they entered. Judge Robert Harrison, in his impeccable suit and with a tired gaze, had already decided Malik's fate before even hearing his defense. To him, it was just another case, another troubled kid who had chosen the wrong path. But Malik knew it wasn't that way. He hadn't stolen anything. Not this time. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and began to read the charges aloud. The sound of each word was a blow to Malik's chest. He glanced to the side, searching for his mother among the few faces present. She wasn't there. She couldn't be. Her fragile health kept her from leaving the house, and he knew that even if she were well, she wouldn't have the strength to face that place. His gaze turned to the door of the room, as if expecting something miraculous to happen, that someone would appear to say it was all a mistake. But the miracle never came. The system didn't believe in boys like him. The prosecutor stood up, a middle-aged woman with her hair tied in a stiff bun, and began presenting the evidence. The store had security cameras, and the footage showed someone running with a package in his hands. The face was indistinct, but the prosecution claimed it was Malik. He looked at the public defender beside him, a thin man in a threadbare suit who was leafing through papers with an expression of boredom. Malik swallowed hard. He wanted to shout that it wasn't him in those images, that he had been somewhere else at that moment, but he knew how it worked. What mattered wasn't the truth. What mattered was what people had already decided to believe. On the other side of the room, the juvenile judge who had handled Malik before was present, silently observing everything. She knew the boy, was aware of his difficulties, but she also saw his record: fights at school, absences, minor offenses. The problem was that no one saw the context. No one saw the hunger, the fear, the burden of caring for a sick mother and a little sister. No one saw the days when he chose to go hungry so his sister could eat. They only saw a black boy from a poor neighborhood, and that was enough to condemn him before the trial even began. The defense attorney stood up, adjusted his faded tie, and cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Honor, I would like to emphasize that my client maintains his innocence and that there is no concrete evidence that he was at the scene of the crime." His voice was weak, lacking conviction. Malik felt a knot in his stomach. His own lawyer didn't seem to believe him. Judge Robert Harrison raised his eyebrows impatiently. "A security camera isn't concrete evidence?" he asked, his voice laced with boredom. The lawyer opened his mouth to reply, but before he could form a sentence, the prosecutor interjected. "The issue, Your Honor, is that the defendant has a history of indiscipline. He has been suspended from school 3 times in the last 2 years. There are records of aggressive behavior. This demonstrates a pattern." Malik felt anger rising in his chest. It was always like this. They took fragments of his life, isolated moments, and used them against him as if it were a pre-assembled puzzle. But no one asked what had really happened in those moments, like the day he got into a fight at school because an older kid stole his sister's snack, or the time he responded to a teacher who called him a lost cause. No one cared about the reasons. They only saw the label that had been slapped on him, troubled, and there he was, alone before a system that never cared about him or his story. The judge sighed, massaging his temples, as if this trial were a waste of time. "Let's shorten this. Does the defendant have anything to say before I deliver my verdict?" Malik felt his heart race. The room seemed smaller, suffocating. He looked at the judge, at the prosecutor, at the lawyer who barely seemed present. He looked at the policeman by the door, ready to take him away. For a moment, he considered remaining silent. What did it matter? They had already decided. But then something inside him screamed to speak. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of all those eyes upon him. "I didn't do it," he said. and his voice came out firmer than he expected. The judge raised an eyebrow, as if he'd heard that for the 1,000th time. "I was with my sister at that time. I didn't steal anything." The prosecutor crossed her arms. "And where is your sister to confirm that?" Malik hesitated. His sister was only 9 years old. How could he bring her there, into that hostile environment? He knew that her testimony would mean nothing against the documents piled before him. The judge tapped his pen on the table impatiently. "Empty words don't change facts, boy. Your record speaks for itself." Indignation boiled within him. He wanted to shout, to say that his life had never been easy, that he never had the same opportunities as other boys. But words wouldn't help. He already knew the outcome of this story. And then, as a reflex, his hand went to his pocket. His fingers touched the crumpled paper he had carried for years, his last resort. The judge was about to announce the sentence when Malik held up the photograph, his only proof that he wasn't what they were saying. The paper trembled in his fingers, but he held it firmly, keeping the photograph visible to everyone. "This is my mother," he said, his voice choked. The image was old, time having faded it, yet it still clearly showed a smiling woman holding 2 small children in her arms. Malik looked directly at the judge. "She's sick. She can't leave the house. I work to help her, I take care of my sister, and now you want to lock me up for something I didn't do." His voice rang out stronger than he expected, laden with a mix of despair and defiance. Judge Robert Harrison, who until then had shown no emotion, narrowed his eyes as he looked at the photo. For a moment, a brief moment, his rigid posture faltered. A strange silence hung in the room. The prosecutor looked at the judge, expecting him to dismiss the photo and proceed with the sentence. The defense lawyer shifted in his chair, as if wondering what had just happened. Malik noticed that something had changed on the judge's face, a shadow of uncertainty, of something unresolved. The judge removed his glasses and then put them back on, leaning slightly forward. "Where did you get that photo?" His voice, once sharp, was now softer. Malik frowned. He hadn't expected that question. "I've always carried it with me." His gaze remained fixed on the judge's face, who took the photo from his hands and studied it intently. His fingers gripped the edge of the crumpled paper, and his face turned pale. The prosecutor approached, confused. "Your Honor?" The judge ignored her. He knew that woman. The silence in the courtroom grew dense, almost palpable. Judge Harrison continued holding the photograph, his eyes fixed on the faded image, but his mind seemed far away. The prosecutor fidgeted impatiently. "Your Honor, do you have any further evidence against the defendant besides those low-quality images?" His voice no longer held its previous indifference. The woman appeared surprised by the question. She flipped through her documents, as if searching for something to reaffirm her accusation, but she hesitated. "Well, we have his school record, which shows a pattern of aggressive behavior." The judge interrupted before she could continue. "Aggressive behavior or acts of survival? Because from what I've heard so far, it seems this boy has endured more hardships than any of us can imagine." The ensuing silence was different from the rest. It was no longer the silence of a hopeless boy's trial. It was the silence of a courtroom that, for the first time, saw Malik as a person, not merely a lost cause. Malik felt something stir inside him. Not exactly hope, but something close. He didn't know where it would lead, but it was the first time someone looked at him and saw more than just his criminal record. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead as if trying to organize the thoughts now colliding in his mind. The weight of the revelation was overwhelming. For years, he had sentenced boys like Malik without hesitation, without questioning the depth of their stories, without considering the context behind their mistakes or the charges against them. But now he was looking at a boy who was his own kin, his own nephew, and for the first time he questioned everything he thought he knew. How had he allowed the system to harden his heart so completely? How had it come to this point, where he saw children only as statistics, Clearing his throat to regain his authoritative tone, his voice came out more hesitantly than intended. "Malik!" he called, and the boy looked up, wary. "If I ask you something, will you answer me truthfully?" Malik hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. The judge continued, "Have you ever stolen anything before?" The question caught Malik off guard. He looked around, feeling the gazes piercing his skin. He felt the urge to lie, to say a simple no, and rid himself of this moment. But something inside prevented him. Perhaps it was the way the judge was looking at him now, as if he truly wanted to hear the truth. Malik took a deep breath. "Yes," he admitted, his voice low but firm. "A few times when we had nothing to eat, but never anything major. I've never hurt anyone." The room fell even quieter. Judge Harrison let out a long sigh, as if that answer had confirmed something he already knew. He hadn't expected an angel before him. He had only expected the truth. And there stood a boy who, despite all his hardships, still chose to be honest. Harrison turned to the prosecutor, who maintained a tense expression. "If there is no concrete evidence against Malik in this specific case, then there is no basis for conviction." He spoke slowly, weighing every word. "I cannot sentence someone solely for what he was in the past." The prosecutor pursed her lips, clearly displeased. "But, Your Honor, taking into account his record," the judge raised his hand, cutting her off before she could continue. "His record is one of survival, not malice." His voice grew firmer. "And if the system is incapable of differentiating these things, then perhaps it is the system that needs re-examination." He picked up the photograph once more, gazing at Lorraine's face. His sister. How much did he truly know about what she and her children had endured? What else did he choose not to see? Malik felt his heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. From the moment he stepped into that courtroom, he had accepted his fate. It had always been that way. No one cared about boys like him. But now the judge, the same man who had been ready to throw him into a cell without a second thought, was questioning the entire system. He clasped his hands on his knees, afraid to foster any hope. He had been deceived by life too many times. Judge Harrison leaned forward, scrutinizing Malik intently. "If I give you a second chance, what will you do with it?" His voice was firm, but there was no threat in it, only expectation. Malik blinked, processing the question. He could lie, say what the judge wanted to hear, but that wouldn't help. Instead, he decided to speak his truth. "I don't want to come back here," he replied without hesitation. "I want to take care of my sister. I want to make something of my life, but I know it won't be easy because it never is." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I'm just tired of losing. I just wanted a chance to try." The judge was silent for a long moment. The gravity of the moment was evident. This was not just another judicial decision for him. It was a confrontation with his past, with the faults he had chosen to ignore for years. He looked at the prosecutor and then at the defense attorney, who looked as surprised as anyone present. Finally, he spoke. "The sentence will be altered." The courtroom was struck with shock. Murmurs rippled through the room. Malik held his breath. Judge Harrison looked directly at Malik, his expression filled with something the boy had never seen before, understanding. "Instead of serving time in a juvenile detention center, you will be placed in a mentorship and community service program," he announced, his voice strong and unwavering. The courtroom exploded in murmurs. The prosecutor shook her head in disapproval, but dared not interrupt. Malik wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. He blinked several times, trying to comprehend what that meant. Harrison continued, "You will have to attend school regularly, maintain good behavior, and participate in supervised activities. If you fail at this, you will return here, and I will not be able to help you." Malik felt the weight of those words. This was not a free pass. It was a commitment, a difficult path, yet different. For the first time, someone was betting on him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir, I accept." His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't avert his gaze. The judge didn't either. The judge's decision left the room in a strange state of shock. Some whispered, clearly dissatisfied, while others simply watched, trying to understand what had just happened. Malik still found it hard to process everything. Throughout his life, the world had told him that he would never have another option but failure. And now, before a man who represented exactly the system that had so often ignored him, he was being offered something different, a real chance. Judge Harrison struck his gavel on the wood, closing the case. Malik let out a long sigh, feeling his muscles relax for the first time since he entered that courtroom. When the policeman beside him touched his shoulder to indicate that he should stand, it wasn't to take him in handcuffs to a detention center. It was to lead him toward a new beginning. Before leaving, Malik looked at the judge one last time. Harrison held the boy's gaze, and for a brief moment, Malik saw something he never thought he would see there: remorse. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. Malik walked out with his heart still racing, but different from before. It wasn't fear. It was uncertainty. What would happen now? He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone against the world. He pulled the photograph from his pocket once more, smoothing the crumpled paper with his fingers. His mother had always said that one day things could change. He had never truly believed it until now. Inside, Judge Harrison remained seated even after the room emptied. He still held the gavel, but now, instead of seeming like an instrument of judgment, it felt as though it carried something much greater. Justice, he realized, was never just about laws. It was about truly seeing people. It was about acknowledging faults, not only in the lives he judged, but in the way the system viewed them. He had spent decades condemning boys like Malik without ever questioning his own narrative. But now, looking at that photo and seeing his sister's face, he knew he could never be the same judge again. Malik walked out of the courtroom, feeling the eyes of some people still on him, but for the first time it didn't matter. He was no longer just a case, a number, or a statistic. He was someone who had been seen, someone who, despite everything, had been given a second chance. Life wouldn't be easy. He would still have to fight, work hard, and prove to himself that he was worth following a different path. But now, for the first time, he believed it was possible. He looked up at the grey sky above the city and for a moment allowed himself a small smile. Inside, Judge Harrison still held the photograph, his eyes fixed on his sister's face. He knew he had much to atone for. With Malik, with Lorraine's memory, and perhaps even with himself. He couldn't change every decision he'd made in the past, nor fix an entire system on his own. But he could start right there, in that moment. He could ensure that, at least for one boy, justice meant more than just a sentence. With a deep sigh, he placed the photo on his desk, stared at the gavel before him, and knew that from that day forward, nothing would be the same.